So it's my honor and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Brother Ray Fitz. Now, I must say that while this is an honor, it is also quite a feat to attempt to assemble any sort of brief bio for someone who is so accomplished and has had such a significant impact on the University of Dayton, the city of Dayton, the entire Marianist family, and practically every person he comes in contact with. I could easily spend a bulk of our time this morning providing an endless list of the ways that Brother Ray has had a positive impact through his ability to be forward-thinking, to empower others, and to be an educator in the process. These are only a few of the many remarkable qualities of Brother Ray that I have experienced firsthand as a student, mentee, and fellow Marianist. I was blessed to have Brother Ray serve in a mentorship role when I lived in a Marianist student community as an undergrad here at UD, because I'm not in high school. But also when I, my wife, and another married couple, Jama and Andy Batinghouse, lived in an intentionally lay Marianist community in the city of Dayton post-graduation. Additionally, when I was working on my thesis project for my master's degree that examined the influence that Catholic parishes could have on poor urban areas, Brother Ray was a key source of wisdom and guidance along the way. In fact, I vividly remember sitting down with him to talk through the research I had compiled after about 6 to 8 months of studying the topic. I felt quite gratified when Brother Ray was very intrigued by my studies and to some of the questions it had led me to, only to soon pick up a resource that he had recommended to find that not only did he have a role in the steering committee that authored it, but that their committee came to pretty much all the same conclusions I did. Yes, it was affirming, but I remember thinking, why didn't he just tell me that in the beginning? But he allowed me to learn, and he was curious if I might uncover anything different or new in the process. This approach is often something I remind myself of when I'm walking with others in pursuit of the common good. Brother Ray, who holds numerous degrees in electrical engineering, has served as the Father Free Professor of Social Justice in the Fitz Center for Leadership here at UD since 2002. It was that summer that he stepped down from his position as university president after 23 years of service in that role. In the region, Brother Ray facilitates participation, collaboration, and learning while embracing the difficult problems of poverty and other social ills. He serves on the Montgomery County's Family and Children First Council. He has also worked on the Montgomery County Human Services Levy campaign. He works with the Dayton Public Schools, Mary Queen of Peace School, and serves on the board of Chaminade Julienne High School. His strong interest in the health of the community extends to the classroom, where he team teaches the Leadership in Building Community seminar. Brother Ray also teaches classes that connect social justice with complex problems within urban societies. He has been a member of the Society of Mary since 1960, and his ability to pair his passion and his ability to empower others with practical intellectual thought has positioned him as an impetus in the Marianist family ever since. When our planning committee dreamed of how this assembly might propel the Marianist family into the future, it became a no-brainer to invite Brother Ray as one of our keynote speakers. We are grateful for his yes to provide his keynote today, entitled A New Moment for the Marianist Movement, Continuing the Conversation. Let's welcome Brother Ray.
It certainly is an honor to be with you today, to be able to reflect a little bit about the Marianist movement and why I think it's so important for the future of our metropolitan regions and for the future of our Marianist family. One of the things that I did in preparation for this, in a moment of arrogance, I wrote a paper. So the paper turned out to be, I haven't got the last part of it done yet, but it's 43 pages with a 10-page appendix. And I figured you didn't want me to read that because I am a very boring reader. But I have a very simple email, and if you would like a copy of the paper when it's all finished around September 1st, I'll send it to you, and I can make available the PowerPoint slides that we have here. So let me give you a little background of my own approach to things. Mike outlined some of it, but I think there's two tools that I use quite often in all the work I do. And if you've ever been in a Fitz course, you will get a heavy dose of what's called constructive conversation. And the constructive conversations are around this ability to identify a question that's really important, to get people to deeply listen to the different ways that people can understand the answer to that question, just deep listening to what people have to say, try to narrow it down to a few good candidates for answers, and then discern what is the answers that we think are the most important. And then, of course, I emphasize you got to document, right? You got to document what came out of the conversation. We often have great meetings, but no documentation. So the reason I'm writing this paper is I've been in a conversation on this Marianist movement, and so that's why I call continuing the conversation. Well, what have I heard? What have I seen so far in this process? Then the other part of it is what I call the reflective practitioner part of my work. Is there's three questions. You can get through with three questions. First of all, what do people want for a hopeful future? What's their hopeful future? What do they dream about? What's important? So every time we go to a neighborhood in the city of Dayton, that's the first question we ask. What are your hopes, your dreams for them? But then we get them to touch down to reality and ask, what is the current situation between your hopes and your current situation? And of course, the third question is, how are we going to close the gaps? How are we going to identify the resources, the assets that we have in this community, and how will we overcome the problems and barriers that we have? So again, constantly reflecting on those conversations, I think, is an important piece for. So I just want to say that there is a connection. I did listen to the talks that we had, other keynotes, and I just thought I would put down two things that I got. If you remember, Sister Iliad talked about strong attractors. And if you ever took a book of her books on, she's got some of the best descriptions of open systems theory that I've ever read. So, and it was by a theologian, not a systems theorist. So I really would recommend some of that. But this concept of strong attractor. In chaos, when chaos is starting to form, there's a strong attractor that brings things together, pulls it together. And she used the example of Jesus as a strong attractor, right? Of upsetting the patterns of the Pharisees and the scribes and bringing forth the kingdom. So, if you want to know what I got out of that is, I want the Marianist movement to be a strong attractor to disrupting the patterns of polarization and injustice in the metropolitan areas of America. And then the second one is Sister Simone yesterday talked about prophetic presence. And I think we need to look at and ask ourselves the question, how will we be a prophetic presence in our metropolitan area for justice, peace, and the reconciliation and integrity of creation? So let me say a few things here. Just quickly, the overview is I want to talk about the new moment, why I think there's one, some short history of the conversation, what's been learned, talk a little bit about Chaminade's journey. I think we're all pretty familiar, and after Spectacle last night, we got some key ideas, right, about. But I want to look at a slanted way of looking at what leadership lessons can we pull out of his life. And then I actually have a vision for the Marianist movement, and then just to make the incoming leadership team a little nervous, I have a whole set of recommendations of what they can. So, first thing is first of all, this assembly, I think, is really dynamite, right? think about how this has all been pulled together, and the energy and the enthusiasm and the learning that's taken place. I came in here on Wednesday. I was so tired I could hardly put one foot in front of the other, and by the time I got to last night, I couldn't go to sleep. There was so much excitement about ideas and things that were happening. So I think that's extremely important, is to see that there's a dream that's nurturing here, something that's happening. And just like Nick and his team took a dream about what spectacle can be, I think we have a dream here that's nurturing. What can we be as we move into the future? I think we see the emergence of at least two that I can count of Marianist family councils, one here in Dayton, one on the northeast part of the Atlantic, northeast part of us. And I begin to think those family councils are pulling together this concept of a regional impact. One of the things that I think some really hopeful signs as I look at our two religious communities. First of all, the sponsorship program, I really believe is really trying to develop a transition strategy that will leave strong Marianist leadership, strong culture and educational tradition in our institutions. And it will be by lay people, because we had enough foresight to see that. Now you look around here to many of the people that are in this assembly, where did they come from? They came from Marianist-sponsored organizations. So that's got to be key to our future. We're going to have to think bigger than those organizations, but if we don't have strength in those organizations, we're not going to have a strong future. And then there's what I call Goal D. Joe Camus is here, and I always talk to Joe about Goal D of Vision 2020 of the Marianist, which was that we were going to, as a Marianist community, collaborate with other elements of the family of Mary to do great things. Now, I can criticize that goal because I was one of the writers of the goal, so one of the things that we didn't say there is, why did we want to cooperate, right? What was the vision that we had for collaboration? So when I got angry and upset about why we didn't go anywhere with Goal D, I said to myself, well, dope, you didn't write a vision there. Why did people want to do this? So I hope we can really reflect and think about this. And then I think the young religious, we have very few, but they are bright, they're thoughtful, and they're committed. And I think we can really build on that future. And then the emergence of the Pulse group, the Partnership for Urban Leadership and Service and Education. It's been a real vitalizing, exciting opportunity for us. And then I think the emergence, and there may be more than I identified, of what I call the lay-sponsored Marianist projects. I've been involved with our founders of the Mission of Mary Farm. It's really excited, but they are incorporated not as an SM or Daughters of Mary, but as a lay-sponsored organization. And guess what? They have to keep finding funding for this, and I think it's exciting. The other example I'll use a little later is the prison transition project that's in Honolulu. I think it tells us that it's really some exciting things that are important. So let me start off by just being clear about what I mean by the Marianist. Oh, let's see, going too fast. Okay, what I mean by the Marianist movement. So start off there with the concept of, we have three autonomous but interdependent communities. The Marianist lay community, which is the largest, the Daughters and the Society of Mary, and somehow we have to find a way to incorporate lay people that are associated with these communities. The second thing, though, is I think I have a definition, so I think I know where I'd like to see this go. And again, it's important to lay this out, and I'd lay this out in a hypothesis, a way of looking at this, realizing that people can come back and say we can do it a different way. But for me, the Marianist movement has origins and charismatic founders. Chaminade, Adele. I think Marie-Therese has a piece to play in there. Some of my colleagues in Europe don't always agree with that. But those founders really gave us a charism. We have a charism that gives us a way of looking at the gospel, an exciting role of the incarnational perspective on the gospel. we have certain practices that we talk about, and I talk about spirituality, methods of organizing, and being in mission. And this is a piece we don't have. Participating in a formation program with common elements that guide people on a journey to fuller commitment. So I'll be emphasizing that. And they share a common missionary vision. So one of the things I ask ourselves as they come into this assembly, do we share a common missionary vision? Now, in my creeping arrogance, I will provide one. But I do that in the spirit of conversation. Is this the right way to look at what we've been hearing and working with? Now, yesterday, Father Dave Fleming gave a talk, program on Marianist charismatic families, and Dave has the experience of being in Europe, being in Rome, being in contact with South America, just a much more cosmopolitan view than I have. But as you listen to what Dave talks about in charismatic families, Dave and I believe we're talking about the same vision for the Marianist family. And both Dave and I believe it's important to develop a common language. So whether we call it the Marianist movement or Marianist charismatic family or the Marianist family, we got to get us a common language. The reason I use the concept of the Marianist movement is because I think we need to have a missionary dynamism. And I think movement gives that. Now, other people hear movement and they think of a clumsy bureaucracy. Well, let's keep talking. I hope I can give you some ways of thinking about that. So just to say, the original presentation I gave on, sorry about that, I'm keeping up with myself. Oh, here's one other thing that's interesting. You know, one day I came across something and I said, oh, I thought I had a great idea. But then I found out somebody had it 20 years ago, the same idea. So Father Quentin Hackenworth, in his Manual for Marianist Spirituality, in chapter 11, says, permeating the world as a movement. Okay? The Marianist family perhaps can be characterized best as a movement in the church, as a movement of the various groups as seen as interdependent parts of an organic whole and autonomous groups of a single Marianist family. Okay, it's been around for a while, so this wasn't in 2009 that we developed this. So we've had a lot of conversations, and I've been able to present this to 20 different Marianist groups. And again, as I said, I'm putting together a paper at the end of this conference that will summarize the conversation as I see it. So what can we learn from our Marianist origins? So Spectacle last night gave us a viewpoint that I thought was just absolutely beautiful. There's somehow that music and singing can touch us in a way that no reflection on the narrative can. So some of the basic resources I've been using are Father Benyak's description of Father Chaminad's project, and then Dave Fleming's book, The New Fulcrum. And I would really recommend that each one of you, I'm not getting a plug from George Lischak on this, I think each one of you should get a copy of this and keep it near where you can continue to read and reflect upon it. That's really our key ideas in that whole process. Sorry about this, I didn't. So, one of the things I want to talk about in terms of Chaminade are some early experiences, some ways of looking at, and I have a bias in the paper that I wrote, which is, there's about 15 pages reflecting on Chaminade's life, but it's around what can we learn about the future? What can we see that he has given to us? So first of all, the early experience that he had with his mother and the kinds of things that happened. I am now a student of early childhood development because that's where the things in poverty are really important. And I can't tell you the importance that literature tells us about early experiences of children. And we have 3 or 4, at least, that I can identify mothers here, and I want to impress with you the importance of that early experience of faith formation. Second thing I want, pardon, Michael foresaw all good things. The other thing I want to talk about is Chaminade's movement to Bordeaux. He had 3 choices. He could have signed the civil constitution. He could have gone to exile, but he chose to go underground. And that, if you think about that, it's what I call a voluntary displacement. He put himself in a strange place where he didn't know what to expect, to know what to have happen to him. And the question I have to us, if we're going to renew the Marianist vision in our time, how do we have to choose voluntary displacement? How do we have to get a new set of experiences that really touch us and give us a new missionary vision? He came back from Saragossa. Saragossa was a time of conversation and discernment. Now you think I'm really onto this thing of conversation, but if you think about what they did in Saragossa, I don't know whether they drank coffee or tea or some wine, but they sat and talked to each other about what were they going to do when they get back. And out of those conversations, they reflected on a prayerful way of what was going to happen. And so, again, I think conversations and prayerful discernment are an important guideline. And then he comes back as a missionary apostolic. He had this profound sense that I have been given a mission to rebuild the church in France, to revitalize the church. I think those things are very important. To understand that missionary intensity that's in part of his life. Again, we know about the founding of the religious communities, and there's many ways to talk about that. I think the literature is not very clear, but for one thing is, from my perspective, I don't think he anticipated the religious communities until some people from the God's providence come and said, this is what we want to do. Now, there's other interpretations of that, but that's my sense, is that he was constantly open to listening to people. What was God telling him through the people that he founded? And I want to just share with you one last thing, is the what I call the Institute of Mary. This was his dream. If you read some of those early constitutions, he put together the sense that the Marianist lay community, where this all got started, was extremely important. Each of those early constitutions had a real emphasis on nurturing the lay communities. And out of that, the Daughters of Mary came, and then the Society of Mary, which we're celebrating this bicentennial that we're working with. But one of the questions is, what went wrong? Okay? Why did it fail? Now, Dave Fleming can give you a lot more details of this than I can, but the government really shut down, as we heard last night, some of the work of the sodality during that period of time. The Vatican wasn't real keen. In fact, they weren't going to allow one superior to be over a men's order and a women's order. That just didn't seem to go. I can't imagine they were that enlightened back in those days, but that was their. Then there's all the problems of local pastors. Local pastors began to see this movement of the Marianist sodalities, and they wanted to capture that vitality for their own parishes. And then finally, as the leadership got concerned about working with the Society of Mary and getting that organized, I think it's really was a difficult situation. If you can imagine, Father Chaminade was trying on the fly to organize this religious community. Those of us religious that came into it, we got to the novitiate, it was pretty clear what we were signing up for. You can read the letters to Father Chaminade, and it was not at all clear to what those early Marianists signed up for. And there was a lot of contention and difficulties as he was trying to pull that together. So, some of the things that I think we need to look at is, Chaminade had a vision of the church that he wanted to make. He gave us this charism, and we know some of the manifestations. We have a spirituality and an apostolic method, I think, are important. But what I want to pull out of this as we review those is, what were some of his principles for institutional analysis and principles for change? Now you're going to say, now I don't ever remember reading anything about Father Chaminade's principles of change. Okay, it's all inferred. I'm giving you my inferences about what I thought was in his mind as he went through that. So a charism. And this definition of a charism comes from the Sisters of Notre Dame down in Cincinnati. I can't tell who was the first one to do it or where they got it from, but in our work with Chaminade Julian, I thought it was an excellent kind of definition. It's a gift of the Holy Spirit for a particular time in the church. Charism, I love this. is a spark from the heart of God dropped into the heart of the founder. So I want to keep using this image, spark, flame, okay? The spark attracts others and ignites a flame. What's the state of the flame going to be as we leave this conference? In the movement to be of service to the church. If the movement is to continue, then the flame must remain strong in the hearts of its members. So, image of a flame. I think I want you to keep a hold of that in terms of thinking about the charism. Now, this is a statement out of our Marianist Rule of Life. It's actually Article 2 of our Rule of Life. In calling us to be Marianists, God calls us to follow in a special way Jesus Christ, Son of God, become Son of Mary for the salvation of all. Our goal is to be transformed into his likeness and to work for the coming of his kingdom. I think there's two things that I want to point out by the pictures there. I have a great affection that I developed from Pope Francis about Mary untie the knots. And the whole image is from Marianist, which said, Eve, by her sinfulness, tied us up in knots, the knots of sinfulness. Mary, in her role as bringing Christ into the world, is the untier of those knots. So I think that, to me, is an image that I think is very strong in Chaminade's way of thinking. The reason I have Revlov's picture of the Trinity there, if you remember, some of you are acquainted with the last readings of the last couple of weeks, these three people that appeared to Abraham. This is a picture of them symbolizing the Trinity. And I want to talk about, I believe, at least as my own reflection, a very strong Trinitarian dimension to our charism. Through the providence of God, the Father. So Sister Ilya talked about the long-range view. So that the view of the providence of God incarnated Jesus Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit. And I do think we need to keep thinking about that Trinitarian dimension to our charism. Vision of the church. Chaminade came back with a vision of the church, and so I'm going to try to ask us, do we have a vision of the church that we're trying to create? What is it as a movement that we're trying to create? He came back with a deep appreciation of what was going on in society, did a real learning of the times. He wanted to be an agent of change, and he wanted to rekindle the faith, flame of faith. So I think he said he wanted to get a church that was like the church of the Apostolic Apostles. There was great love. There was witness to faith. Was a real sense of being beacons of hope. But this was a community continually filled with the gifts of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit was touching them in very different ways. And what else? They could share resources. They could share talents. And they were committed to the faith even through death. I think there's what I call the Marianist practices. First of all, our spirituality, such things as the prayer of faith and the system of virtues. A method of organizing. He had a way. Now remember, this is not a method of organization. This is a method of organizing. It's a dynamic, ongoing, moving type of thing. The three offices, good meetings were part of that. And he had a method of mission, or some call the apostolic method, which was multiplication of Christian communities and real strong discernment of direction for the mission. We all know the manifestations. Again, Father Dave and Brother Tom Giardino have helped us understand some of these ideas. It's the formation of faith, especially that strong faith of the heart. It's Mary in the roles of a woman of faith, responding by her yes, a mother who nurtures us and forms us in Christ, and we are in mission with her to bring Christ into the world. We are a community of disciples. We have this sense of being interdependent, a missionary focus, and creating unity across diversity. But what I want to point out is some change principles that I think are important in Chaminade. And of course, I would have things out of sequence in my notes here. See, I was actually doing this early this morning, so you can imagine. So I think the one notion that I've gotten from Chaminade is he chose voluntary displacement. Going underground, he made a choice. He had other choices he could have made. What choices are we making to get ourselves into a new situation where we begin to get a sense of the mission, the missionary urgency? Do we walk out of here with a sense that there's a mission for us to accomplish? He received his vision through conversation and prayerful discernment. When we have meetings as the Marianist family, do we add prayer into our discernment process? I think that's important for us to think about. He engaged others in the missionary conversation. You know, I have an image of what the Madeleine Sonality was. Chaminade would have Mass. He would see some people that kept coming back to the Mass. He said, I'm going to engage those people in conversation. We're going to talk about what we can do. Okay, I just believe we've got to find places where we can gather people and where we can enter them into conversation. He took time to communicate the vision. If you look at his letters, he's constantly dealing with problems and issues, but he always brings it back to what the vision is. He encouraged people to take broad-based action and this whole concept of adaptive learning through experimentation. Now, you can say, nobody said that about Chaminade. Well, I think if you read the story, you can see these things are there, very important. So I want to talk a little bit about the signs of the times that we're dealing with. I have this image called the fractured city, which I hope I can plant in your mind because I think it's important. It reveals to us some very important things. First of all, the silent violence of poverty. I want to really try to talk about that important kind of issue as we go forward. It can talk about the breakdown of the civil community, and then we can talk about the state of faith in the church. Who's from St. Louis? Okay, we got some St. Louis. I could have picked on any city to do this. It's not just because I have anything about St. Louis. But if you look at a map there, and I'll only give you a few of these, okay. But at the bottom, you have a grid that tells you the darker the number, the higher the percentage, okay? So if it's real light, it's a low percentage. If you're up high, it's in 75%. And so what you see there in this is, in 1970, there were only a few center city neighborhoods of poverty, of high poverty. St. Louis was in pretty good shape in the 70s. That as we moved into the 2015, taking that census data that's available, what do you see? You see many more pockets and neighborhoods of high poverty. If you go to the next slide, and if I superimpose where the African American population is, percentage, you can see that there's a high overlap of the population into the poverty neighborhoods. And again, I'm going through this fast because I want to make sure we have time for more conversation. There is this whole concept of the African Americans on this particular graph as the green are concentrated in those high poverty neighborhoods. So I don't think it's too far to say that in North America we have become economically and racially segregated in our cities. So I use this concept of the fractured cities. We're divided into neighborhoods where the high poverty neighborhoods are usually in the center city. The suburbs are where the more affluent neighborhoods are. And there's racial minorities that segregated in the high poverty areas. So again, the silent violence of poverty and neighborhoods. So I just want to reflect. This was an image of two families that were in the New York Times Magazine. The one family is in the top 5% of our economic. It's an African American family with 4 children. The father is a founder of a technology consulting firm. The mother is a tenured professor at Boston College. Their income is in the top 5% of their community. Now, if you look at that picture, I often ask the students, what do you notice about the picture? Now, I'm not going to go through that with them. But the fact that there's a piano in the house and a young man sitting at the piano tells you something about the kind of environment that's there. The other picture is of single-parent mother with 2 children, very little income from her former husband or the father of her children. She was a housing advocate, but she lost her job. She has a 2-bedroom apartment in which she has to pay $1,450, and her average monthly expenses are about $1,500. That woman is in poverty. She has real problems. And think about the 2 children that she has. So what I want to do is try to move this along a little bit. I recommend to some people a book that you want to read. And I think the best book that tells a good story about this is by Robert Putnam. He's the social capital person, you know, that did a lot of work on that. He talks about our kids, the American dream in crisis. He talks about these 2 neighborhoods, these 2 ways of living. Talks about the impact of families, parenting, and schools on communities. Okay. Now, I spent some time, I got to speed this up, I can see that we need to really think about the impact of these 2 neighborhoods on our children. And again, in the paper that I've written, I think it's important for us to see that there are some really strong impacts that keep children in poverty and actually keep them in that particular state. And again, we can look at all those different influences that are there. But here's the thing. I could go through lots of data and statistics on this, but I think we need to rename the opportunity gap. The opportunity gap doesn't touch our heart. It doesn't really say how we need to change in this whole process. So I think listening to experiences and stories of people that are in poverty, so I'm going to make this notion that the Marianist family, the Marianist movement, has to touch the lives of people in poverty. You have to sit down, not just serve them a meal, but you have to sit down and have conversation. You need to listen to the deep stories, the pains that they are experiencing, the alienation of being in high poverty. And I think that the reason I call it the silent violence of poverty in high poverty neighborhoods is because we're very indifferent to it. None of us think about this kind of poverty, this violence that's being done to our children in these high poverty neighborhoods. And as Pope Francis tells us, you know, this whole culture of indifference, I believe, has affected us as a Catholic Church in our metropolitan areas. We can debate that. Okay, Archbishop Laurie. If you remember, Baltimore had this problem with Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray was apprehended by the police. We don't know all the details, but from what we do know, he was probably unfairly beaten and hurt, went into a coma into the hospital, and eventually died. And so Archbishop Laurie had a mass right around the time of the trial that was going on. I think these words are telling. What we do know is that Freddie Gray's death has brought us to the surface the long-standing issue of what we call in Catholic moral theology structural sin. Structural sin or social sin goes beyond individual wrongdoing. It is the sum of people's injustice and indifference and ends up creating a society where it is very difficult, almost impossible for human beings to flourish, to lead lives that are happy, productive, and secure. And by the way we live our regional life, we have condemned a whole lot of people by the structures of our society to a life of hopelessness. We wonder why there is great drug addiction issues in many of our major cities. It's because of this problem of hopelessness. So I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what is our contribution? We Marianists, what is our contribution to the social sins of this fractured city? I'm not trying to create a guilt trip. I'm just asking us to think about that in terms of important issues. And I know the one that really impacts me is this concept of white privilege. I do really think by reading about that, reflecting and praying about it, we begin to see that we have sets of taken for granted assumptions about life that are not shared by everybody, and I think impact There are three additional challenges for the fractured city. One is you can't get people to talk regionally. You can't get Centerville to talk to the center of Dayton. You can't get any kind of conversation. I had a bloody experience of trying to bring together people to talk about this experience. If I ever wanted something to say, don't get involved in politics, that was it. But it's this concept of self-interest of these jurisdictions, really having any kind of bridging capital. Nobody in these jurisdictions knows one another. It's again, this divided. And so we have this strong, as Sister Simone talked about, I think it was her, about the culture of individualism. I can take care of myself. I don't give a damn about those people in the center city. I just can't even worry about that. And, as Pope Francis tells us, we have this culture of comfort, of waste, of indifference. And again, we have to keep asking ourselves, how does this impact us as members of the Marianist movement? And then the other one I think is pretty dramatic to me is the suburbanization of the Catholic Church. Now I have a whole bunch of slides that show how the Catholic Church has moved out of the center of the city of Dayton. At one time we had something like 8 or 9 Catholic schools in the center city. On the west side we have one that is barely struggling to stay alive. What has happened? The Catholics have moved to the suburb. Why did we get to move to the suburb? Because we had a good education, we had strong families, we were able to go to college. We had all the advantages, right, that made us upwardly mobile. And then we decided, let's, like everybody else that's upwardly mobile, we're going to the suburbs. The problem is that we started to move all of our resources to the suburbs. We built churches and schools there, and we abandoned the schools and the churches that we had in the center city. Now I'm telling you, go look at your diocesan paper archives and you're going to see a long history of this abandonment. And so it says that we have abandoned the urban core as a church. How are we going to impact the injustice of poverty if we're not there? And I think if you have this image of the fractured city, I think we have an image of a fractured church. I'm just building us up to some challenge, right, that we have to deal with. Now the last one is even, I think, more dramatic. He thought Chaminade was dealing with some issues of difficulties with faith and some of those kinds of issues. So let me just ask you questions. What is the second largest religious denomination in the United States? Former Catholics. You got it. Gee, you guys are pretty good. At what ages do people stop practicing the faith? It's in their late teens, in their early 20s. We've lost, in that period of time, I think the number is like 30-some% from 18 to 23, and then from 23 to 40, lots of them. Mass attendance, well, it's really down low, okay? And then for millennials, we really have a real fall off. So this problem of religious indifference, Chaminade thought he had some problems. We got equal problems of religious indifference. So I believe we have a major crisis of faith in the church. Okay, so what are we supposed to do? Okay, so now one of the things that I do, this is, you have to understand how my mind works, as I think about these kinds of issues, I say, what would be a good solution? All right? So I sat down and I drafted a vision statement for the Marianist movement. So the Marianist movement within a region is a dynamic collaboration, Marianist lay and religious communities, that is a catalyst and a partner. Okay, now here comes the tagline. What am I going to put there, right? For creating a Marianist style of evangelization within the church. So I think it's important for us to think about what is that Marian style of evangelization. And I'm sorry to be cutting all this kind of short because I don't know how to manage my times. So let me just use this. I think here's some elements that I really would like us to consider. And during the question and answer period, I can explain some of this, and then we'll have a follow-up session which will allow us. But I think, first of all, I tried to do this with the dialogue between Chaminade and Pope Francis. You know, Pope Francis in 1903, pardon me, 1913, is that right? That's, you can tell I'm a completely confused individual. 2013, we had Pope Francis as a new dialogue partner. Unbelievable. Unbelievable in terms of the challenges. So his whole concept of missionary disciple is profound. It's, if you look at Evangelii Gaudium, it's that with the challenge that is there is extremely challenging to become a missionary disciple. And I believe Chaminade shared this whole concept of the essential is the interior. The call for missionary disciples to have a strong prayer life, a strong community life. Second, I think what our style of evangelization is going to call us to do is multiply communities of encounter and dialogue. Now, if you look at the breakout sessions that we had, how many of those breakout sessions are talking about methods of encounter, methods of really growing and learning how to talk nonviolently, right? I think those are important. Being poor and for the poor, I think is extremely, we have to find a way. If I think there is a displacement, a voluntary displacement for the Marianist movement, is we have to move in and attach ourselves, engage ourselves, participate with people in poverty. Being a prophetic presence. I think that Sister Simone did that yesterday pretty well. I was fortunate that I had this on my list before she talked, so you know it fit into what she had to say, and I'll say a little bit more about that. And then the last one is mobilizing lay leaders in the church. I think this is so important. Now I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm going to go to just, sorry about this. Okay, how are we going to be a prophetic presence? Some of you might have known the work of Walter Brueggemann, who wrote the book called Prophetic Imagination. And it was a very simple idea that he had. I mean, he does a beautiful job of taking the Old Testament and parts of the New Testament. A prophet critiques the power structure of the kingdom that's there and offers a vision of hope. So those two things are extremely important. Then my other hero here is Bishop McElroy from San Diego. We Marianist brothers had a chance to talk to him. I have on my bar, you know, where you can get to the internet real quickly, I have it to that San Diego diocesan, because every time this man speaks, this Bishop McElroy, he is a Francis man all the way through and through. And he has this concept, if you read some of those things, about disrupting and rebuilding. Disrupting. He had an article in Commonweal, Disrupting Trump. And when he talked to community organizers, he said, how do we act as disruptors to society, and how do we rebuild? And I thought maybe a way of putting this together is this concept of disrupting, reimagining, and transforming. Now, criticism and grief. Why do I put grief in there? If we're not experiencing grief at the injustice of poverty, if we don't somehow lay awake at night thinking about the suffering of people, we're still not in that prophetic stance. We have to suffer with them. Religious imagination, right? How can we think about a better future that we can help people see and have a sense of rebuilding hope? And then the work of transforming. How do we go from where we are to where we want to be? That whole struggle of creating strategies that closes the gap. Okay. Let's do some practical orientations. So I talked about a vision statement for the Marianist movement. So again, what's unique about us as a Marianist movement, now I'm just laying this out for conversation, is that we have a Marian style of evangelization. We have a mission statement. Again, this is just drafting for people to think about. We do it by witnessing, forming, and transforming. Again, these are some words I picked up from one of our young brothers, Brandon Pollock, who kept talking about this is the way he sees the Marianist vision. I think it's a good way for us to look at that we're having these communities of witness, we're trying to form missionary disciples, and we're actually working in solidarity with others. We need a strong counsel. Let me go to this one. Okay, now, a lot of people say, what do you mean by this thing of movement, all right? So I want to give some examples. And this is what I call, there's a role that we have to develop in the Marianist movement called the network weaver. And the network weaver is a person who knows where different talents and abilities are in different facets of the Marianist regional group. And that network, by knowing that network weaver can identify a common project, task, or an event. So just like the organizer said, we need somebody to do the liturgies. They got people together to make that happen. So that concept is they got recruited into that process. Now, I think this is a powerful concept of how do we weave the resources of our Marianist community. I give one example here. Molly Bardine works at Chaminade Julienne High School, and Molly has what's called the Capstone Project. And some of the students entered into and thought about the problem of food deserts. Well, what does a networked weaver do? It identifies these students who want to do something about food deserts, and what do? Connect it to the Mission of Mary Cooperative. So you can think of this concept of how do we mobilize energy. I think we need to deepen and share the Marianist practices. I have a couple ideas here which I want to throw to our leadership team. We need to have a pathway of formation. What is it? What are the steps of formation? And I think we need what I call a common curriculum between the religious and the lay people about what are the important parts of this. Another thing is we have to develop people who can accompany. When I was at Berkeley for a 6-month sabbatical after being president, I had a lay woman who was a spiritual director. She was powerful. Are we within our lay community developing people who can accompany us on that missionary journey? And I believe we need to pay a special attention to young people, to how do we evangelize and work with young people and share our Marianist practices. Again, focus on urban solidarity. I think the concept of being engaged with people at the margins, I'm going to really recommend that we keep thinking about that. But then, how do we use that location with poverty to build bridges within the fractured city and within the fractured church? I want to give an example of that's happening in Honolulu. It's the prison transition project. The Marianist lay communities there have really done something that's, I think, really outstanding of helping women, not just visiting them in prison, a great work of mercy, but accompanying them as they move to self-sufficiency. I think this is great. What the lay Marianists make us feel like family. I've never felt this much love in my whole life. You need to feel love. That is what people need most when they're in transition out of prison. That lay community has touched some people's lives and helped them develop self-sufficiency. Oh, now this is another one of my crazy diagrams, but be patient. At this conference, we've talked about 2 different ways of working at justice. The first one I call the top-down approach. Sister Simone is great at that. She goes and knocks on people's doors and wants to get policy changes so that it impacts, right? The way we deliver health services, the way we develop welfare services, it gets shaped by the policy. But there's another way of working up, which is from the bottom, working for conversion of hearts, moving people up towards really living a life of justice. I think the space for the Marianist is in the middle. I think we are really good at taking the personal and moving it into the civic space of where we have families, we have schools, we have neighborhood associations. How do we work in our local community to bring about justice? That catalyzing of local justice orientation can move up to the policy level. So again, I'm just a thing to put out there. And then finally, I want to suggest two other things for our leadership team to think about. How do we develop the intellectual and professional capital? You know, one of the things I'm really worried about, I mean, I do sit up, I can't sleep at night sometimes thinking about these things. Where's the next generation of Marianist scholars, okay? We have a Dave Fleming, we have a Tom Giordino, but where are the next? Sister Gabby, I have great hope for you. But she cannot do it alone, right? Where are the lay people going to become scholars in this Marianist movement? Where are we going to be the intellectual leadership that's needed? I'm telling you, as I looked at these ecclesial movements, and Dave talked about some of them, that whole concept of lay leadership and intellectual leadership is extremely important if the movement's going to move forward. Marianist movement in the professions. I know there's a group of you talking about having Marianist business associates. Do it! Get together! Don't just talk about it. No, but I mean seriously, and I think we all see that by taking initiatives, we make some things happen. I do think we need to think about the next generation of leadership. I think it's important for us to sit down and have a seminar or some kind of convening to what are the skills that we need for this leadership. What are those skills? How do we define them? And can we develop a school for leadership? Can we really work with developing leaders? Couldn't every summer we have some place where at least 10 or 12 people from the Marianist family are coming together to talk about leadership? 3 questions. Are we really going to take the flame that we have from Chaminade and from Adele and Maria Therese, and are we going to really leave here with a deep commitment to it? I'm going to do it myself, and I'm going to have my communities do it. Am I committed to a prophetic presence in our metropolitan regions? Are we going to be able to speak out as a movement about injustice? And are we willing to say yes to the Marianist movement? Thank you.
We do have about 10 minutes or so that we can do some Q&A with Brother Ray. And we have a wireless microphone, so if you do have a question, just raise your hand and we can bring the microphone to you to make sure that the room can hear you.
I have a question.
So I really like the idea about the Marianist family being and living in that civic space, that slide that you had there in between the top down and the bottom up. But I think the challenge of that is it's a place of tension, and even more so in our heightened kind of political divisiveness culture that we live in today. And so it's recognizing also the vision of Chaminade that the family be diverse in terms of background and this kind of thing. So I feel like we have this problem in the sense of we are in spaces of affluency in most regards, and so the challenge of one, diversifying the family, and the second challenge, I think, of how to live well in a space of tension, you know, and function well in that space of tension. So not really a question, but some comments, and I don't know if there's anything you want to expound on there.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, it's pretty clear, looking around the room, we're pretty white. We don't have the opportunities that I think we need to have as a movement of being present. Who do we invite to dinner? Who do we go to church with? I think those are serious questions that we have to really reflect and think about. So I do think Brian's way of stating this is we are in this great polarization. That's why I call it a fractured city, and it's a fractured church. Now, what is our role as a Marianist movement? Remember, I said one of the ways of Marian evangelization, a Marian style of evangelization, is to create communities of encounter and dialogue. I think what we have to be so profound at is how do we set up those spaces for encounter and for dialogue? And that's what we have to develop the leadership skills. I have this analogy, okay, 10 years from now, when we go to Wikipedia and we look up the Marianist lay communities of North America, what are they going to put down as the 5 or 6 essential things that we're trying to accomplish? Okay, what would they put down? Somebody would write that little story. I think one of them has to be this whole concept of creating communities of encounter and dialogue. We have to have the skills to do that. It's not easy. I can tell you, I've been in Dayton community here at UD 48 years, and I have flopped miserably at getting this to move forward the way I think it should. But you have to keep trying to develop those skills that are important. So I agree with your analysis. That's why I use the image of a fractured city, a fractured church. How do we become a bridge of encounter and dialogue? That's a real challenge for us.
Thank you. I'm really grateful for the term voluntary displacement. Now when Marianists ask me where I've been, I can tell them I've been voluntarily displaced for the last 20 years since I left the university. But what I wanted to talk a little bit about was the experience of moving to the margins and carrying grief. And I'm wondering if you can share with us some of your personal or spiritual practices about how you kind of navigate carrying the grief and the suffering.
So in my many things that I truncated, I want to tell 3 stories. You have to first encounter people by listening to their stories. At one time I was at the Dakota Center and I was tutoring this young man in mathematics. I thought I was a great mathematics teacher. I could really get this person excited and thoughtful about mathematics. So we agreed he was going to go home and do this homework. He came back the next day and he hadn't done it. My German mentality was ready to bop him on the head, but the grace of God said, no, step back. And I asked why he wasn't able to do it. He said, I was locked up in my room because my mother's boyfriend was just beating her so badly last night, I couldn't even think about doing mathematics. That's an experience, right? But if you don't listen to that experience and understand the suffering of that young person, second experience, I was working on the Child Protection Task Force, and I knew a lot of things about theory about child protection, but I didn't know on the ground. So one night I went with one of the social workers to go visit a family. This mother was losing her child, had lost her child, and was trying to get reunited, but she had an alcohol addiction problem. I'm truncating a 45-minute conversation. This social worker worked with her so hard, and at the end of it she said, yes, I'll do anything to get my child back. The social worker goes and calls on the phone to get a placement for alcohol treatment. This is a woman in poverty, has to use the public system. I'm sorry, we cannot place her for another 9 months. So you get this woman right at the point where she wants to do a deep conversion, and we as a community can assist her. Third example. This is not mine example, but it was a friend of mine told me this. She was in a classroom working with students and asking the perennial question, what do you want to do when you grow up? And there were airplane pilots and there were, there were doctors. She came to one young man and said, what do you want to do when you grow up? Well, I'm going to be in jail. And then she promised, she said, why? Why are you going to be in jail? because every male that I know in my immediate family is now in jail. Again, that's suffering, that's alienation, that's hurt. So I only got the first part of your question, is how do you get the grief? You have to listen to stories of people. Secondly, you have to feel the pain. Not that you can say, I've been there, and no, I think the point is, I'm listening to you, I hear you, I have a sense that I'm with you. And then you got to turn that grief into constructive action. What can I do? But I really believe part of being a prophetic presence is to experience grief at the injustice that we have in our communities. And that will change our hearts. If there's anything that will change our hearts, it's the stories of people that are in poverty.
We have time for one more.
Your comment about the Catholic Church losing people is something that I've experienced, and I have so many former Catholic friends, and within my parish, it's where I find the energy to reach out and try to make a difference in my community, where you can find like-minded people. But more and more, it seems that people aren't coming to church, that it isn't providing what people are looking for. And so that is something that I struggle with, that it's a big question. I mean, when you travel in Europe, you see the churches there are museums. People, I think are finding things in different places than they used to, and we haven't adapted to try to be something different. And I don't know if you have any insights.
Big question. I have no answers. But here's the thing I find is on our college campus at the University of Dayton with our 7,000 students, I don't know what the right percentage is, but there's a large percentage of students that don't give a damn about faith. They don't care, just get me through here. My parents paying for me to go. They're almost innocuous to trying to talk about learn, lead, and serve, right? But there are some people that you can have conversations with. And I found that there are, oversimplified again, two types. One, that are really excited about justice issues. And you can have conversations with them, and you can slowly say to them, how are you going to sustain this justice commitment over your lifetime? What is the role of this faith community, and what can it play? The second one is we have a lot of conservative Christians, a good number of conservative Christians who like adoration, the rosary, and those type of things, and we have to talk to them. But we have to invite them to go visit the food pantry. You have to invite them to go visit the homeless shelter. So again, I told you my image of Chaminade when he opened up the Madeleine's sodality in Bordeaux. It was a place of conversation. He got people and was ready to talk to them about mission. Not just chit-chat, not about the weather, but about mission. And so I think wherever we are, we have to try to engage people in that question of what will feed them, give them long-term purpose. Thank you.
We do have a small token of appreciation to offer our thanks to Brother Ray as well. So.
Thank you.